to be in this one.
I think you are, yes.
Good.
And you were notes writing, so I was wondering if I can nick some of your pen and
I was
paper.
almost on stage talking.
Otherwise I will.
Oh, I found the right one.
How should I introduce you? What's your title?
I am the head of head of curation for Moments
For Twitter Moments. Does that work?
Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I know. I'm sorry. Should
No,
I write it
no.
down?
Curation, Twitter Moments, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Got it.
Nope, nothing. I am completely on water. Water would be lovely. Still.
It's really warm in
It's
these.
absolutely sweltering. Like, the level of oxygen must be so low.
My daughter put a temporary tattoo on it that I completely forgot about. It's a New York style. There's also pizza.
So how's it going? Are you now back over the fence?
Yeah, it's great. It's good to be back in beautiful chaos. Creative people.
Well, don't let technologists hear you say they're not creative. Are you going to FA next week?
I'm not. Jared Darcy goes.
Right.
So much.
Just for colour. So, well, no, to interview. These are interviews with people. So, yes. They don't necessarily. Well, maybe. Don't know that. Don't know. I mean,
Oh, I thought you
there
guys
was.
were on the panel. I was like,
No, Alexa says, oh, if you come to FA, we can probably get you some interviews, but there are also people I know, both who are not.
Welcome, everybody.
Research group there who I
Welcome.
be our students. So.
Is this on? Yes, this is on. Terrific. Thank you very much, everyone, for your patience. Both of those of you who were in the room and enjoying what I gather was a very good panel that had started a little bit late, so sorry for sort of barging in on your panel, but also very much those who are patiently waiting outside, including the panelists. This is the panel on platform publishing, ? And I think the question mark is an important part of our conversation today. We will be discussing what's arguably one of the most important things going on in the digital media environment right now, the increasing importance of intermediaries like search engines and social media in terms of how people find and access news. And we will talk both about some of the issues some of the ways in which publishers think about these issues, but also hear from Joanne Gary, who represent one of the platforms. So we have today with us a fantastic panel, in my humble opinion, to discuss this issue. Emily Bell, who is director of the Tao Center at Columbia University. Raju Narisetti, who is senior vice president for strategy at News Corp. Liz Heron, the executive editor of the Huffington Post, also with a past at Facebook. And the special guest added after the program was printed and even after it was put online. Joanne Gary, who is head of curation for Twitter Moments, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I'm Rasmus Nielsen. I'm director of research at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I will say a few things about some of our own work in this area, but mostly I am here to listen to and learn from our distinguished panelists. So what we have agreed is that Emily will kick us off, since she is one of the people who have spoken and written very publicly about these issues and has a very clear sort of take on what some of the issues at stake are. I will add a few observations from some ongoing research we have at the Reuters Institute in this area, and then we will hear from the people who are, should I say, in the trenches or in the collaborative meetings in which some of these issues are being hashed out as we speak. So with that introduction, Emily, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rasmus. Just a sort of brief introduction. I'm Emily Bell, Director of the Tower Centre, which is situated in the Journalism School at Columbia University. Before that, I was a journalist for a long time. And the last 10 years of that, as many of you know, was at The Guardian as an editor and sort of director of digital. And a lot of my job there was really trying to put into practical application the idea that as journalists we should, and journalism organisations, we should integrate much more closely with the fabric of the social web. And as a result, we employed brilliant people like Joanna, but we also kind of had initiatives to use Twitter early, etc., etc. So this is a kind of a cautionary tale because it's slightly be careful what you wish for. Since then, and at the Tower Centre, we're now doing a whole series of different research studies on the relationship between platforms and publishers. So anybody who actually has something interesting to say, come and find me or Dr. Claire Wardle, our research director, because we're doing content studies. We're also doing a sort of a landscape review as well, which you should have in your hands in the next couple of months. And my interest in this really is partly as a practitioner and now as an academic to say, what does it mean when publishing really becomes one of the activities of platforms? So in speeches I've given in the past, I've said that for me, the really serious issue here is, if you like, kind of not exactly a losing of independence of the press, but a dependence on a completely different distribution ecosystem, which in many ways, it has to be said, is better. So, you know, there is no doubt that getting your news through the tools that engineers at Twitter and Facebook build is better in terms of how quickly you receive it, in terms of the overall user experience, in terms of the design, perhaps than many publishers in, you know, in their own websites. But there is an existential risk attached to it. And what we've seen in the past year is a progression from where platforms were saying, we don't really get involved with this stuff, we just carry what you guys do, into them saying, no, we are active actors in this area. Even if they don't identify themselves as publishers, they are taking on more of the role of publisher. So you had Snapchat Discover launched at the end of January, you had Facebook's Instant Articles launching in April last year. You've had Google's accelerated mobile pages and also their digital news initiative. You've had Twitter Moments. So you're beginning to see these kind of like seamless acts of news publishing. I don't think there's any alternative. I think that journalism has to be more tightly integrated with the social platforms that people use and that they find useful for getting news. But big questions about transparency, how and which stories are promoted and how is something which in much more open systems like Twitter is kind of obvious. In more closed systems like Facebook is not obvious, and it can be opaque. The next thing is business models. We know that at the same time that we see this big rise in mobile social use, we're also seeing the rise in ad blocking, which is making it harder for news organisations to monetize their digital content. Again, I will say that's not wholly a bad thing, in that there are lots of trackers and data capture on mobile advertising. It's not something that publishers have done particularly well. They don't get free pass on that. Platforms often do it better. And we're at the beginning of a new conversation, I think, which says, is the balance of power healthy? Is it something which we have enough clarity about, both as publishers, but also as citizens? You know, is this something where we need to reevaluate what we think about the fourth estate? And a lot of this is very obscure. We don't really know. It's very early days, and we don't quite know how this is going to play out. So, for instance, on Instant Articles, you hear some publishers going, they're tremendous and work very well, and others saying, we're seeing absolutely no effect whatsoever. So there's an awful lot to sort of pick apart. And my overarching view is that there are 2 or 3 really big issues embedded in this in this overall sort of shift, which, as I say, I don't think it's an argument about whether we should be going there, because I think that's happened. I think that's already happened. It's more about, are there things that we should now be doing to affect the terms of practice and service and ethics within that field? Thanks,
Thank you very much, Emily. I should say that I'm very much inspired by a lecture that Emily gave at the Reuters Institute a little while back. I mean, we've been trying to address some of these issues by talking to different publishers and platforms about how they handle this relationship in light of the very rapid development that Emily is outlining. And just in terms of sort of by virtue of a bit of background on this, if you will, that in terms of how we think about how people get news, just to remind everyone in the room of how important this is growing in some markets. Last year, in the digital news report that we do every year at the Institute, when we surveyed online news users here in Italy, for example, and asked people how do you find and access news online, 20% of these online news users in Italy said that they found and accessed news by going to news websites. 66% say they find and access news via search engines, and 33% say they find and access news via social media. And mind you, this is before the development of the new initiatives that Emily highlighted, like Facebook Instant Articles and Google AMP. So in terms of the audience engagement, this is a quite dramatic change from a time in which publishers largely controlled many of the channels through which they reached the audience, insofar as the audience wanted to be reached. The interviews we've been doing with publishers across Europe and North America, I'm working with a colleague of mine, Sarah Ganter, on this project. I think we can sort of tentatively identify 3 different reactions from publishers' side: coexistence, confrontation, and collaboration. And very sort of clearly, what we might think of as sort of reactive coexistence is by far the most common outcome. Most of the media organizations we talk to essentially say, to quote one person we interviewed, they are huge, we are tiny, what do you expect us to do? So obviously Google and Facebook are not forces of nature, but if you are the editor or the publisher of a small regional newspaper in the US or in a European country, they can sort of feel like forces of nature that you have to adapt to. A fisherman may think of a storm coming in or a change in the ecosystem. There are also some news organizations that have, on occasion, not on all fronts and at all points in time, but on occasion confronted the platforms on specific issues. News Corporation is one such organization in the US. Axel Springer in Germany is another one, but it's very important, of course, to underline that this is not all confrontation all the time. Springer just gave the Axel Springer Award to Mark Zuckerberg. And of course, many News Corp brands works closely and constructively with many of the platforms. So it's not sort of all-out war, if you will, but there are moments of more public confrontation. And then there are examples of collaboration where it's clear that some of the people we interview will say we have very good relationships with the platforms. It's significant to underline here that till very recently, with the expansion of the media engagement teams from some of the platforms, these collaborations have overwhelmingly been between a few nationally and internationally oriented, very prominent English language brands. And that even very major news organizations, media organizations in other countries and operating in other languages have not always felt that they could get the same level of engagement. And there's been some frustration that I think is still colors the relationship between some publishers and the platforms, a history, if you will, of less constructive engagement that is playing out right now. When we think about how this relationship is developing in practice, I think we would make the observation that there is a distinction between sort of an editorial, operational, day-to-day set of decisions that are made where in sort of digitally ambitious organizations, for very understandable reasons, every day editors make decisions to experiment with and embrace new formats developed by the platforms to increase their reach, to try to find new audiences, to deepen engagement and experiment with new forms of journalism. But these decisions are often made at least as far as our interviews suggest, not in all cases, but in many organizations, with relatively little systematic consideration of the longer-term strategic implications of doing this. Now, I don't want to generalize and say this is the case always, but in many organizations, this is sort of an incremental embrace of new initiatives over time with less systematic evaluation of what the longer-term implications are for the news organization, say, 3 years down the line. What drives this sort of day-to-day editorial engagement and embrace of these new initiatives? One thing, of course, is proof of concept. There are news organizations out there who have shown conclusively that you can build very large audiences very rapidly and that obviously is very attractive for many organizations. That slightly darker companion to that incentive, if you will, is the fear of missing out. So the way the pitch can sometimes be hurt, if you will, from the point of view of publishers is that essentially a platform will come and say, we have this new thing, it's going to be amazing, we can't tell you exactly how or why, but you're going to be sorry if you're missing out on it. I mean, obviously, the language is more, is not exactly put in those words, but this is the way it may sound, if you will, if you're a publisher and you're approached. And it takes some confidence and strategic thinking as a publisher to say, actually, I think we will hold our horses and think about our relationship, because it can be quite hard to assess if you don't know what exactly is this project, and if you can't access the data or validate the data as a publisher to evaluate what is actually the longer term implications for us and the real potential here. And this is a sort of frustration we hear in some of the interviews that we do. It's also clear, of course, that just to loop it back to that sort of first quote, that they are huge and we are tiny, which even in news media terms, very large news organizations, I think increasingly are recognizing that they are quite small compared to platforms with global reach, especially like Google and Facebook. That the relationship is in many ways asymmetrical. The platforms are technology makers. Most news organizations are technology takers. They adopt to a changing environment. They very rarely themselves change the environment, though some do, and there are impressive examples of innovation and invention in some news organizations. But of course, it's important to underline, it is not one-sided. You don't have to do it. I mean, you may fear that you're missing out, and all your buddies may say it's going to be great, and we are doing it. But there is sometimes a tendency in the news industry to engage in sort of irrational imitation, if you will, where you do things because everyone else is doing it. And it is a choice that news organizations will make, and often a choice that they'll make for good reasons to engage. I mean, I think it's important to say that in our conversations with publishers, there are very few people who fear that this is sort of a doomsday scenario. I mean, there are some people who are worried about sort of some loss of control, but very few people that we speak to who genuinely fear that this is sort of the end of their direct relationship with consumers and users and audiences. And they see real potential, real beneficial, constructive engagement from the platforms and real potential in terms of reaching the audience. But how they deal with it varies. And not all of them, if you will, see that they have some sort of agency here. So that's why I think it's terrific that we have the opportunity today to hear from people who are thinking about this relationship and who have made informed choices about how to engage with these platforms. So with this, Raju, I think this is where we turn to you.
Thanks, Rasmus. That was a good cue. Just a quick overview of News Corp, because that will inform some of what I'm saying. We are a holding company of about 15 or so companies, out of which there are a few news companies. Very different brands, Wall Street Journal, the Times of London, The Sun in the UK, the Australian, the New York Post, Market Watch. And each one of them has a very different brand position and a market position and a business model. So how each one of them reacts to these platforms usually are decisions taken by the brands rather than at a News Corp level. But we do have some fundamental principles that we want all our brands to think about before they jump in feet first in embracing or not embracing these platforms. I think it'll be fair to say that we have a kind of a love-hate relationship with the platforms. Actually, it's a little bit like Tinder. Some features you swipe one way and some features you swipe the other way, depending on the feature. But the reasons I love platforms personally and as a company is, both Rasmus and Emily have mentioned. One is the sheer size, right? I mean, when Facebook has 1 billion plus active monthly users and 1.6 billion total users, Twitter has a couple of 100 million, Snapchat has big numbers. It's hard not to engage those audiences where they want to be, and you have to. The days of asking them to come to us are increasingly dwindling, so you have to be where they are. And if they are on these platforms, you want to be there. And these platforms do make it very easy to reach a big audience that you necessarily don't have. So clearly you love that about them. I also like the fact that but for Apple and Google and Facebook, I don't think any big media companies would have paid attention to the fact that our websites are such crap, right? They're like slow, they are cluttered, we load them up with a lot of code, and there's just significant performance issues. And it's only the push from, I think, Facebook Instant and Apple News and Google AMP that have actually forced publishers to acknowledge that they do have a fundamental problem in user engagement. And hopefully we will, we are learning from that, and we are trying to fix some of our own issues at our own websites as well. So great credit to these platforms for kind of driving that thinking in news companies that have ignored this for 20 years of having websites. The other thing you like about it is some of them offer significant business opportunities. We have a company called Storyful, which helps people discover journalism and news on YouTube and on Facebook. So we work with them as a business relationship, so there's a clear business opportunity there. So those are the things you kind of love about them. The fundamental issue that News Corp has with some of these platforms is we don't want to mortgage our future. It's as simple as that. And by that I mean we believe in multiple streams of revenue for our content. We believe in advertising. We believe in subscriptions for lots of our brands. And we don't want to give one of them up simply because it doesn't fit in with the business model of some of these platforms, which Emily talked about, business model issues. We also believe in the value of trust in the sense that people come to the Wall Street Journal, they leave behind data both voluntarily and sometimes involuntarily because they trust the Wall Street Journal. The last thing we want to do is to give that out to the Facebooks of the world by having our content on Facebook where somebody comes in and Facebook keeps all the data and we have no control over that. So that's a profound issue for us as well. We also have a strong faith in our brands. I mean, the Wall Street Journal is 127 years old. We think that it'll be around for hopefully the next couple of hundred years out from now. And a lot of these platforms, while they may take your content, really blur the brand identity. It's very hard to kind of uniquely identify these brands, especially when they're curated news. So we want to hold the line on that as well. So lots of reasons to like them, lots of reasons to kind of question how much you want to do with them, and it depends really on your business model and depends on your brand and your geography. So it's hard to kind of respond to social media or platforms at a very generic level. So we're not doing much with Facebook Instant. We have significant challenges on the data front. We have significant issues with not being able to kind of help our subscribers access it in a unique way on Facebook, and Facebook hasn't particularly solved those issues yet. I'm sure at some point they might, and if they do, then we'll think about it. Apple News, we are in there. Apple has been a great partner in terms of selling apps and subscriptions, and so we work very closely with them because it fits in with our subscription model wherever we have paid models. Twitter has been a good platform to disseminate our journalism. A lot of times, our paid subscribers often discover content because of Twitter, right? And then they come to us and they have subscribed to it, they can access it. So we use Twitter as a way to inform our own subscribers sometimes that, hey, Wall Street Journal has this great story and you can read it because you've paid for it. So it works that way as well. We are active participants so far in Google AMP because I think anything that helps speed up web pages is a good thing. I wish that Google AMP wasn't as much a prescriptive framework as it is now because they exactly tell you what you need to do rather than telling you that we'll measure speed and you can get there whichever way you want and we are happy about it. It doesn't do that yet. So there are some issues there as well. I also, in this conversation, you tend to forget that there are bigger evils out there in terms of data and in terms of destroying your brands, things like Taboola and Outbrain. Right? We should not ignore them when we think about it. We tend to focus on Facebooks and we tend to focus on the big names, but a lot of these third parties are doing much more damage to your brand, to your data, and the trust people have in your platforms. So it's very important, at least for News Corp, to make sure that we are protecting our audiences from such third parties by not allowing them to kind of take data or take our audiences or kind of really put a lot of seemingly interesting but totally junky stuff on your own websites. The other thing to think about is that we tend to kind of focus on platforms as they are now. To me, the bigger issue is what are media companies doing about what is clearly the next wave of where audiences are going to be. whether it is AR and VR or whether it is chats, right? And if you are Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, they're already kind of, they've invested in Oculus, they're big on Messenger, they own WhatsApp. They're already 2 steps ahead of you, and here we are talking about how do we interact with Facebook. And that's where I think big media companies still are playing catch up and thinking about today instead of kind of saying, what is my response going to be? How am I going to engage people in chat when Facebook owns like 2 of the biggest kind of chat platforms? So I think that's something that as media companies we ought to think about now rather than 5 years from now, sit here and have a panel about all these amazing messenger platforms are taking over the world and we are all scrambling to kind of figure out what to do with them. But we can talk about it a bit more. So I think it's a bit of a nuanced approach, but you have to have some fundamental principles around which you kind of make these arguments. You can't get carried away by the fact that everybody else is doing it, as Rasmus said, or you can't get carried away by the fact that their interface is sexy, or they're saying we have X amount of millennials, and you don't want to kind of jump in and then figure out that it's actually going to hurt your business model later. So, thanks.
Thanks very much, Raju. Liz, the Huffington Post is a very different business, so you probably have a quite different perspective on some of these issues, but not all of them, maybe.
I do. So let me just take a little step back and give you a little bit more about my background so you understand where I'm coming from. Liz Heron, I joined the Huffington Post about 5 months ago. Before that, I was managing strategic partnerships at Facebook with media organizations and journalists. And before that, I've been a digital journalist for my whole career, but in very traditional newsrooms like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. So for my whole career, I've been sort of thinking about these issues and trying to stay 1 or 2 steps ahead of the present and look toward the future. And my 2 years at Facebook were really fascinating for that reason alone, because it gave me sort of this 30,000-foot view on what was happening in the media industry at a very important time for the topic that we're discussing here, the relationship between media and platforms. And now at the Huffington Post, my experience there is really informing the way we think about our relationship with platforms as well. So first of all, we have sort of 3 principles that we try to keep in mind. As Rasmus said, we're a very different business than a lot of the News Corp businesses. We're entirely ad-supported, and scale is a big part of what we do. We're also, it's a huge part of the HuffPost DNA to be incredibly nimble and try to stay ahead of what's coming in the future and really embrace change, even if that change is a little bit chaotic and we're not entirely sure where it's going. We see that the world is changing dramatically and we want to change with it. The second thing that we think about is relationships with these platforms. I think last year was the year that the media at large woke up to the fact that platforms were actually a really big deal for what we do as journalists. This year, I hope, is the year that we all start to wake up to the fact that we can develop actual relationships with the people behind the platforms, the people who make the products, because they are just like us. They are people, and they have goals, and they have things that they care about, and sometimes those things align with ours. But if you don't ever make that effort to get to know what they care about and how they think, it's going to be very hard as a media company to understand what to do next and how to take advantage of what they're offering and how to avoid some of the other things that just aren't going to work for your business or for your mission. The other thing about relationships is it's important to remember that, again, these are people behind the platforms. Oftentimes they're very smart, very mission-driven. They feel like they're doing good work in the same way that journalists feel like they're doing good work. So it's just a question of approaching those relationships with mutual respect. But you also need to understand that the media does have leverage. I think sometimes we feel like we don't have leverage because, as Rasmus was saying, we feel tiny and they feel large, and that is a reality, yes. Platforms like Google and Facebook are much larger than any one single media company. However, think about the fact that, Huffington Post is working with Apple News, with Facebook on a variety of products, on Google AMP, with YouTube, with other platforms as well, and they have all come to us. Like they're now coming to the media, wanting to work with us and creating products specifically for our businesses, which is a really fascinating turn of events and should tell you something about what we mean to them. When you look at what kind of content people like to consume and share and interact with on these platforms, oftentimes it's media content, it's journalism. So just keep that in the back of your mind that they want to talk to us as much as we want to talk to them. The last thing at the Huffington Post that we talk about all the time is that in a world in which we as a company are truly embracing this distributed media landscape, our identity and our mission has never been more important. When you are as distributed as we are and want to be, you need to understand who Huffington Post is. All of our readers and viewers need to understand it. We need to understand it within the newsroom, and we need to make that brand and identity incredibly clear because it becomes everything. Raju is saying that in some of these platforms, all of the media companies start to look and feel the same. And that could be true for product reasons, but I think there are ways to get around that. You look at a company like Vice, which has a very specific voice and brand. You look at a company like Vox, which is really making inroads with their explainer brand, which is something that not a lot of media companies were really paying attention to. And you look at HuffPost, what we're trying to do is really make good on a promise that Ariana Huffington started about a year ago to reinvent journalism around not just the problems in the world, but also the people who are solving those problems are looking for answers. And this, we want to be a news plus action platform for journalism. And we think that this is truly where we're going to make our distinguishing mark and where our identity and our mission is going to make a difference and break through the static. So we talk about this all the time, and partly this is informed by my recognition while I was at Facebook that, when you do have that 30,000-foot view of the media, you start to realize how similar it all becomes. We used to, as media organizations, have our own audiences and our own platforms, and it didn't matter if we were all covering the same things because you kind of had to for your audience. But now that we're all playing in the same platforms and the same environments, it ends up commodifying that kind of work. So we talk constantly at the Huffington Post about how to break through the static, what stories we just don't even need to cover, and what our role is into this ecosystem in a distributed media world.
Thanks very much, Liz. Joanna, you work at one of these platforms. So when Raju is sort of swiping, it's sort of Larry, it's Mark, and then Jack. And then you work with Jack at Twitter. So what's your perspective?
I don't feel like I can take a curtain away and suddenly reveal something magical to you, though. So I'm gonna manage expectations before I even start speaking. My name's Joanna Geary. I'm currently looking after building curation teams within Twitter for a new product called Twitter Moments that really it certainly doesn't exist in Italy yet. It exists in the US. It launched in October, and it launched in London in December. And we're currently rapidly building out teams to be able to launch it elsewhere. What it is it's a human layer to content discovery for Twitter. So I think it's worth remembering, as Liz sort of alluded to when she was talking, that platforms tend to be producing these new products to solve problems that they have. And sometimes that coexists with problems that the media industry has, and sometimes they can work together. But understanding the reasons behind why a platform creates a thing and understanding who you are, which I'll go back to, is really important when kind of approaching these potential opportunities. Twitter's trying to answer the question, how do you know what's going on Twitter at any given time? There's a lot of product feedback, and loads of people have been talking about it. There's incredible moments that happen, excellent content, incredibly important people saying incredibly important things, but if you're only following, I don't know, one parody account, you're not going to discover that. So Moments is about trying to give you a slice of what's going on that's really powerful on Twitter in a kind of more narrative visual form. We do that through working with partners who can create collections of tweets or moments themselves that are then displayed on our platform, or with a small team of curators inside of Twitter. And one of the things that we're really excited about within it is that we've tried to use the products of other organizations as well. We're using Google AMP, so to help make sure that when people click on links within Moments, they display quickly. We're still really young, and we're still learning a lot about how a Twitter user audience is responding to that sort of surfacing of content. But one thing that I have noticed, and this sort of kind of fits into a whole narrative of my career, because I came to Twitter from The Guardian, and before that, the Times, and before that, the excellent Birmingham Post newspaper, which is a regional paper in the middle of England. And so what we've discovered is that the things that really work, the partner moments that really work, are from partners who know who they are and what they're about and the type of stories that they excel at telling. So for example, in the UK, one of our standout partner moments in terms of performance was by The Economist. In fact, they've been one of the best in terms of producing really engaging moments that have been about analysis of big events. So one that did particularly well was one where their business correspondent in Paris did analysis of the 3 things that the Belgian bombers were trying to achieve with the devastating attacks that took place. We've also seen incredible reaction to reportedly who have been using moments to find eyewitness content in conflict zones and be able to tell the story of events that have been going on. And then another one of our unexpected, really stellar partners has been the British Met Office, which is the weather service, who've been really, really good at being able to engage users in explanation as to why a certain day is the start of spring, or what the temperature is going to be like this week, or here's a really funny looking cloud. Why should you be interested in it? But I think the fact that it's these organizations who seem to have a really strong sense of who they are that are really enjoying the platform kind of fits into a bigger sense of the relationship between platforms and publishers as a whole. Back when I was at The Guardian looking after social media, so much, and again this probably fits into what Emily was saying, so much is driven by fear. A fear that we must do all the things. We have to do all the things because everyone's telling us all the things are important. And so I would regularly, I would have pieces of paper available on what our Google Plus strategy was, or what our Instagram strategy was, or what our Twitter strategy was, so that every time someone read a newspaper article or an industry think piece,
very good strategy.
I would be able to hand them
as well. Yeah. Exactly.
I would be able to hand them a piece of paper and go, "It's okay, we're thinking about this. We understand who we are, and we understand who the platforms are and what they're trying to achieve. And here's the bits where we're crossing over, and it's going to be okay." And I think we need to remove that fear by opening up these sorts of conversations, by news organizations building those partnerships with platforms, and platforms obviously who are keen to work, and probably more than people realize, to collaborate, to try and help people achieve their goals as well as theirs, because ultimately we only get to do what we want to do if it also helps you do the same thing at the same time.
Terrific. Thanks very much. I have a couple of points that I wanted to sort of hear people's perspective on, and then I'm thinking it might be a good idea to give Emily a chance also to ask questions to a couple of the other panelists. I think you may have things you would like people to respond to maybe. But Raju, I wanted to ask you a question about the sort of the relationship between being a publisher and being a platform. You've probably seen this in your work, but for example, in September last year, the BBC's response to the current charter review in the UK, they launched this idea of the BBC as a platform. So do you see, and you can think about Axel Springer, for example, in Germany, that's investing in a joint venture with Samsung around this Update mobile news initiative. So do you see a future in which a company like News Corp may start thinking about itself as a platform, which indeed one could argue newspapers were historically platforms in some ways?
I don't think News Corp will ever think of itself as a platform simply because News Corp is not a consumer-facing brand. And we've been pretty clear that we shouldn't kind of get all our brands in different regions to act like a single ecosystem, because the audiences and the needs and the content they come for and the journalism they consume the most is very different. Because the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal are 2 floors apart on the same building. But in terms of their journalism, in terms of their content and their audience, there could be 10,000 miles apart. So I think to think of ourselves as a platform, I think would not serve our readers very well. But where there are opportunities to kind of engage, so if we have a conversation with Facebook, we can have all of our brands present and have a single conversation about, here are some things that are important to us. And I think there is some leverage, but I don't think it's necessarily in terms of like telling audiences that we are broad enough and kind of interesting enough that it's a choice between us and something else. I think that'll be I don't think that'll be a wise, also it's a scale issue, right? If you add up all of our monthly unique visitors, we'll probably get to about 200 million. Still significantly smaller than some media brands, let alone the Facebooks of the world, right? So I think the scale still doesn't work, and scale for scale's sake has never particularly worked. But I think there are opportunities. I think it makes sense if a phone company like Samsung is willing to talk to you about doing things with you across the board. I think those conversations make a lot of sense. But it's still brand by brand in terms of how it interacts with readers who use Samsung.
Thanks very much. Liz, a question for you, in a way sort of playing off one of the things Joanna said. Who do you think of as your competitors? I mean, one thing we hear a lot in these conversations that people feel they compete with everyone, but that can't quite be the way you see it. I mean, but if you see cultural institutions, museums going on the platforms, competing for attention, political figures, celebrities, sports stars, and so on and so forth, I mean, who do you see as your competitive set when you're trying to define the editorial identity of the Huffington Post in this very distributed environment?
That's an interesting question. I think, obviously, we look at our traditional media competitors. I say traditional, I mean, they are other media companies. In the traditional sense, they are our competitors. But Huffington Post is a little bit of a different kind of media company. We really prioritize partnerships. We always have. We're also a platform in addition to a publisher. So, we invite a lot of other organizations to come and work with us on, on different projects that we work on. In some ways, you can look at us in our competitive set as Medium when you look at our contributor platform versus Mediums. In other ways, it depends on the kind of work that we're doing. Like right now, we're investing a lot of time and energy and resources into really taking advantage of live streaming, mobile live streaming. I think the transformative effect here is that it's now able to be both produced and consumed on your phone. So Huffington Post has been into participatory live video for many, many years. But this is an excellent step for us that we are leaning into greatly, that now we can do this on Facebook Live, on Periscope, on platforms like YouNow. And we look at our competitors who are doing participatory live video as a whole different competitive set. So it really depends on where we're spending our time and our resources. I would say that I don't feel particularly competitive with individuals using social media. I personally think that is a wrinkle and something that has changed in the last few years for media, that they are no longer gatekeepers to information, that individuals can go out to platforms and get their word out. But the power of the media to amplify those things is still not unparalleled, but still quite strong. So at least in the present, I don't see them as like big competitors to us.
Actually, I had, sorry, on the back of that, I had a question for Liz and Raji, which was just as you were mentioning live video. So Facebook did a broadcast this week around live video through BuzzFeed, and certain publishers, including BuzzFeed, and I don't know whether Huffington Post is one, are being financially incentivized by BuzzFeed, sorry, not by BuzzFeed, that would be great for all of us, but not true, financially incentivized by Facebook to use these products, and actually sort of, kind of, there is a classification of publishers, so I don't know if it includes the Huffington Post. I checked and to see whether it's not the Guardian does it, because I'm on the board there. I don't think they do, as far as I could tell. How do we sort of feel about that? Because there is this thing now where, with that complete kind of, integration of what platforms and publishers do, it suddenly made me think, this changes the shape of journalism, right? This changes, Facebook can change the demands on a newsroom to produce different types of content, and it's incentivizing publishers to do that. How do we kind of, ethically, how do we feel about, should we be all declaring, it feels to me like we should all be much more transparent as publishers. I don't think it's a problem for the platforms, but for publishers, should we be much more sort of transparent about what those relationships actually are?
Well, I can't speak to the business relationship between Facebook and the Huffington Post, but what I can tell you is that I agree that is a big shift in how media companies work with Facebook. It's, however, not something that's never happened before. You know, I think even 5 years ago, YouTube was paying media companies to do political coverage for the 2012 election. You know, the rise of Vice can be seen as a YouTube success story. YouTube incentivized and resourced Vice to produce video on its platform, and Vice became a video company in a way it never was before, and look at it now. So it's not that these things have never happened before. I would say that any media company offered something like this needs to A, think about the long-term consequences, and B, make a decision not based on short-term monetary gains, but whether or not this is the right thing for them to do in general. For us at the Huffington Post, like I said, we have a fairly long tradition. We're a 10-year-old company, so we don't have a huge, long legacy, but fairly long tradition, 3.5, 4 years of really putting a lot of resources and creative energy into participatory live video. So, you know, regardless of what, I didn't even know that Facebook was going to make such a huge deal out of Facebook Live. In fact, nothing like this ever happened while I was at the company. From what I understand, they took a 1-year product roadmap for this product and condensed it into 1 month, which is very unusual and pretty significant. But when I and Ariana and our newsroom were thinking about live streaming video and mobile live streaming, that wasn't really a part of our calculations. To us, it was like, this is something that we care about as a company. This is part of our identity. This allows us to do more with our mission, so we are going to invest in this way of telling stories. And it's also, you know, for us, it's part of our DNA to want to sort of reinvent journalism, to make news for a new generation, to do things a little bit differently. So we were really excited by the idea that when it's on your phone, you can go and cover, you know, the American election primaries. We're doing entirely on Facebook Live, and we're sending 3-person teams out there, and we're doing it in a way that's really different. You know, sometimes we'll just let the camera pan out over where we are. We'll let the commenters guide us and tell us where to go and who to talk to and what to ask. So it's like a fun creative challenge as well, and it's really resonating with our audience because I think it's something new and fresh. So we're doing it for our own reasons, and not because, you know, Facebook is suddenly prioritizing this. That being said, I think it is worth any publisher noticing when a company like Google or Facebook is putting a lot of investment into a particular product, because you never know, but that probably means that they are going to put a ton of investment into it, and it's going to be stable for longer than some of the other products. I'll tell you one short little story about something that Facebook executives talk about all the time. To their credit, they often internally discuss failures so that they don't repeat those failures again. And I don't know how many of you remember, maybe 5 years ago, there was a product Facebook put out called the Social Reader. I believe the Guardian and the Washington Post.
Social Reader, yeah.
Yes. Do you all remember the Social Reader? It was where you connected.
Which was kind of like instant articles. It was like the forerunner to it in a way, wasn't it?
I don't think so. To me,
okay.
Sorry.
Seemed really similar to me, but it was like instant articles works better, but this was a way of reading your site.
Yeah, it's a close integration with media company and Facebook, but it's quite different in that, for those of you who don't remember, if you connected Facebook to your Guardian account, everything you read on the Guardian would appear on your Facebook profile. So it quickly was sort of a huge disaster because people were like self-censoring, and they didn't necessarily want everything they read to show up into their social graph. So, Facebook had made these deep integrations and deals with media companies like The Guardian and like The Washington Post, but they ended up having to kill the product, which did a lot of damage to those relationships with the media companies who had invested a lot of time and energy into this product, right? And they were seeing huge audience gains, and they were really excited by it. But the lesson internally that Facebook repeats over and over again is that the thing that went wrong with that is that they made something that was great for Facebook, it was great for their media partners, but it was bad for people who use Facebook. And so, going forward, that's how every new product is evaluated, is it has to be pretty valuable for all three, for a partner, for Facebook, and for the people on Facebook. So that's just a useful lens for anyone watching a platform company to see where they put their investment resources, because it's likely that that's how they're thinking.
I think the principle to remember here is that when a for-profit company is willing to pay you to do something with them, usually there's a profit reason behind it at the end of it. I think a lot of media companies, because of the state of our industry, tend to forget that and take the money because it's easy money in some ways. And you continue to do the journalism that you want to do. So it feels like it's the right thing to do, but I think you just have to remember the motives. Look, the Gates Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the Ford Foundation, they all give money to media companies to cover certain things. These are nonprofits, but have an agenda in that topic getting covered. And I think once you disclose it, and a lot of media companies have taken it, the FT, LA Times, and a bunch of people have taken money from some of these foundations to cover some important issues, and they disclose it. YouTube was actually pretty good about it, and when they went to a lot of media companies and said, we want you to create YouTube channels, and we'll fund it for you. And I think it was a program where you could actually apply if you're a media company. And the problem I find with oftentimes with some of the new ones, including Facebook, is that there's just not a lot of disclosure. I read like everybody else that apparently some companies are getting paid. And there isn't a blog post says, yes, we are, and here's how you should apply, and here's the guidelines. The lack of transparency and disclosure in how you run your platforms, I think, is a significant problem. I talked to somebody here the day before from BuzzFeed Canada who was saying, oh, last week Facebook didn't send us a lot of people. He has no idea why, but that's what happened. Next week, apparently, it's great. Last week was not good. And it has nothing to do with their journalism. And all of you remember Upworthy, right? 2 years ago, everybody talked about it, and I don't even know when is the last time any of us ever talked about Upworthy. And it's all because you rise and fall at the kind of mercy of some of these big platforms. I think that is the fundamental problem we have with some of these big platforms, which is that they're not being very, very transparent about either motives or actions or the rules of the engagement. And as media companies, we owe it to our readers to kind of push for more transparency, to say that we will partner with you, but we need to have a lot more clarity about the rules of engagement.
Joanna, I wanted to ask you, I mean, obviously, with the exception of me, no one on this panel is afraid of anything. You are all fearless, and you all work for fearless companies, but there are risks, there are challenges and opportunities. So I think it's relatively clear what some of the challenges are for publishers. There are challenges around maintaining editorial identity when other people make decisions about what gets surfaced. There are challenges around data, who has access to what. There are challenges around revenue. And there's the fear that you might be the next Upworthy or Demand Media, for that matter, the Panda update that seriously impacted the content farm industry. So do you have any sort of thoughts on what this looks like from your side of that relationship, and sort of what are some of the risks that you are trying to manage at Twitter?
So for better or worse for Twitter, they haven't put me in charge of very much that involves the actual business. So I can't talk to sort of like the higher level strategy of the business, and which is oft debated elsewhere anyway. I guess like it's similar, right? Like you have business objectives, you have things that you want to achieve, like we want to help people discover content on the platform, and you start to build products that you hope will answer those questions. But just like anyone who builds any product, you don't know if the first version or any version of what you've got will provide that answer straight away. So I think that we have all of the risks that are inherent in making those bets, right? I think we have an additional risk that's a very high profile bet. We used to talk in newsrooms about the fact that we were so inherently scared of failing that we wouldn't try in the first place. And I think that it's nice to be in an organization where they've never really felt that before, but I guess like increasing scrutiny does make you think, gosh, like we've got to really try and make this work, and we need to carve space to allow a product to grow before people attempt to kill it on our behalf, through their own observations. So I guess that in many ways we are not dissimilar from any business that's investing in technology to try and solve an issue or a problem.
Thanks very much. I mean, in some ways this panel is exactly like Mark Little described Twitter earlier today. It's about live public engagement. So I want to make sure that people in the audience have opportunities to ask questions of the panelists as well. But while people sort of formulate that question and as the volunteers get ready to sort of walk around with the mics, I wanted to ask you a question, Emily, as people get ready to ask questions from the floor. Do you really think the website and the branded news app are about to become extinct?
Well, I think the website, I've written this, where I said that's probably the next thing kind of under the wheels of the bus is going to be, once you've got rid of print, then the next thing to go is going to be your website. Only in the sense that, I mean, I don't, everything still needs a home, right? But the people put an awful lot of effort into worrying about their web design. And if you're doing that from the perspective of thinking about it as a sort of a browser-based product, that probably really is a waste of time. So I think that everything is going to mobile. Every piece of data that you look at, your own behavior, everything I mean, there are people still reading things on browsers, but just increasingly as a news organization with scarce resource, the amount that you put into web production and upkeep is disproportionate, I suspect, to the returns you're going to get from it in the long term. So mobile native app, your own mobile app is really interesting. So we have seen this trend from places like BuzzFeed, which said we are all about distributed content. We really don't care what our front page looks like. We never want anybody to even come and look at it. I remember Ben Smith early on saying, I don't really look at the front page because I'm kind of hoping, and I'm sort of hoping nobody else does. And actually just recently they've started to produce their own news apps, because I do think that even in the sort of distributed utopia of places like BuzzFeed, there is a worry that if you don't hang on to something which is your own, and you don't, particularly if you don't, to Liz's point about really addressing your fan, your hardcore fan users, sort of, I mean, the journal, I got into trouble with the journal's social team for saying I didn't like its Snapchat channel, which I don't, but I do love the Wall Street Journal, and they said, they made the perfectly reasonable point, it's not really for you, because you're old, and also you're much more likely to use something like the app, because you're a kind of a sort of a super fan. So this idea that you give up, I think, everything about your identity, you have to do one of two things. You either have to say, forget that game's gone, we probably won't end up maintaining, we'll probably just end up maintaining kind of like a studio version of a news organization, and kind of hope that our brand comes through in the type of journalists that we work with, and that they will just work on any type of platform that's available, but we won't really maintain anything outside the most sort of basic archive and CMS. But then you have to build your business externally on something else, or you have to be not seeking profit or return of any significance. But if you're not going to do that, then I think when Mark Thompson, we had a conference called Journalism in Silicon Valley in the fall, or the autumn, as we like to say in Europe, where Mark Thompson, the chief executive of the New York Times, said we absolutely have to cultivate our own presence. I'm not giving up on that, and I do think it will be about really building strong and special mobile products for people who are going to give money to the New York Times. So I think sort of giving up on there's clearly a balance here, but giving up on everything about destination is difficult. I don't think it's a straightforward yes you should, no you shouldn't. If you look where usage is going, I do think that there is, I think that most news organisations would privately admit, if not publicly, that they spend too much money and too much resource on a website which is not necessarily very mobile friendly.
With that, we should open up. I'm sure there'll be many interesting and important questions from the floor. So we will start over here in the corner.
Thanks very much.
Sorry, you should introduce yourself when you ask the question, please.
Helen Derbyshire from the organisation Access Info. I've done a lot of work on transparency of media ownership, out of the idea that we should have an idea of where the news is coming from and be able to ensure that we're promoting plurality. Both Emily and Roger, you've talked about the challenges of transparency. One of the things that you've mentioned is the need for perhaps the publishers to be more transparent about their relationships with the social platforms. But Emily, you also raised the concern of a lack of transparency about how articles are selected, which are promoted. And I'm really wondering how we achieve that transparency, and do you have any ideas for how that might be done? And in this shifting environment, is there even a place for regulation to require, for example, transparency of some of the algorithms which are doing this selection? I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I I think it's a great question. There's a really good paper by Dr. Martin Moore out from King's College in London called Tech Giants and Civic Power, where he talks a little bit about journalism, but it's mostly about what we call the GAFA companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and how they approach transparency or civic power. And he makes, I think, a really powerful point in that way. He says, when we talk about regulation, we're often talking about things which actually are, the instruments we've got available to cope with this are in some ways completely inappropriate for the times that we're working in. And I kind of thought that's absolutely hits the nail on the head in terms of where I think we are with platforms and publishers, which is we need an open conversation about it. So the first thing you need is mutual understanding of why Facebook doesn't want to open more of its news algorithm. And Facebook has been actually sort of much more open than it has been in the past, not least because of great people like Liz going, we should be talking about this. So that we can actually have an understanding of what the appropriate level of transparency is. And then I do think it's, sort of convene conversations and shared understanding and standards and public education, kind of like this is not just about journalism, this is kind of about everything. And media is just one bit of what we're going to be accessing through social messaging apps or mobile apps or whatever they are. So getting people to understand what that level of transparency is, I think, is a journalistic job. I think it's a regulatory job. I don't think hardline regulation, Europe's been more effective than any other domain in sort of tackling some of these issues, but some of the regulation's been quite, very controversial and sometimes quite clumsy. Like, is the right to be forgotten a good thing or a bad thing? I was in a panel at Columbia sort of 2 days ago where I thought people might actually come to blows over whether this was the best thing that has ever happened or actually a really ghastly piece of sort of mistake which has corrupted sort of how we see archiving, etc. So I think, first of all, it's just like understanding, general understanding, and how we get those sides sort of, that's dialogue and conversation. I think it's not going to rest on one or two authorities. It's got to rest on people being interested. But I do think news organisations should be much more active about how they think about these things and how they report them as well.
I think there's regulation and there's regulation, right? I mean, as a for-profit media company, I totally sympathize with the fact that asking Google or Facebook to kind of disclose how their algorithms work, which is the secret sauce, goes against the fundamental business model that they have, which is that's what make, right? But how they use that to make other decisions should and ought to be regulated. I'll give you a couple of examples. Take Google AMP right now, right? What happens if the algorithm starts favoring only those news brands that embrace AMP versus those that don't, right? You're penalizing them in search. And does that happen or not should be disclosed. And if it's not, that ought to be a question that regulators should ask, saying, does your search engine favor AMP versus not favor those who are not in AMP? Because you're driving people to a certain behavior by that action. Right? Or sometimes it's, can you apply common sense? For years now, major news brands have been asking Google search to say, why don't you disclose the origin of a story when something is searched for? Like, who broke the story? Why don't you pin it up as part of the search results? That's never happened. They'd never do that. And that's a very simple way of transparency, saying, the Washington Post first did this story. So show that and pin it, and then show all the other results. Google always says it's a great idea. It's been 20, 30 years of talking about this, not 30, but it never happens, right?
Yeah.
So there is an intent to be transparent, and there is an actual action. And those kind of things ought to be, I think, pushed for and regulated. But asking them to disclose how their business works and the secret sauce, I think that's a bit unfair.
There's a question here at the front, the lady in the second row.
Hi, I'm Ivy Volin. I'm head of digital development at a regional media house in Norway, and I used to be head of social media at the NRK, which is the Norwegian equivalent of the BBC, and has an equal standing in Norway. I want to comment on what you said about power relationships, and I'd love to be in a position where I was able to cultivate relationships with Facebook and with the Facebooks and Googles and Twitters of the world. But it appears to me that It's really what you were saying about earlier, Rasmus, the feeling of meeting a force of nature. Because I probably have the best relationships with Facebook or Google of anyone in the Norwegian media scene. And that means I get information on what they are about to do, and we get invited to try a couple of new functionalities. That is a long way from actually being able to sit down and talk to someone who is able to influence decision-making at the big platform companies. So there is a huge power imbalance. And I guess I kind of want to ask your advice on how we, as small entities in small language countries, can maneuver ourselves into that sort of negotiating power with the platform companies, because that is really one of my headaches. I'd love to be able to sit down with Facebook and say, hey, this would actually work for us. But I don't see how we are going to get in a HuffPost position.
I mean, just to footnote that before the response comes, I think many local and regional newspapers feel that way about public service media in parts of Europe, but we should...
Very true.
You know, I don't work at Facebook anymore, so I can't really speak for how they would or should handle it. But I will say that what you describe is real. You know, one way to think about it in sort of pragmatic and real terms is that the media companies who do have the standing or have the ability to go in and have those conversations with real decision makers need to be using that leverage on behalf of all media. And really think about it as part of responsibility on their part to be collaborating and thinking of themselves as part of a media ecosystem versus just, I'm getting in there to get what I want. And I think you'll probably start to see that, and it actually was happening a little bit when I was at Facebook. So it's not the best answer, but it is a pragmatic answer.
Joanne, do you want to speak to this too? I mean, Twitter is also not quite the scale and size of Google and Facebook, but still a partner people are interested in talking to.
Yeah, so I think scale is a good word here. We're 10 years old. We have partnerships teams that have been growing all the time. We tend to be better at partnerships where we have partnerships teams in those countries. So I know that team cares very deeply about trying to scale, because realistically, there is probably 2 people in the United States who are responsible for all news organizations in the United States. There is one lady in the UK who's responsible for every single media partnership that we might have in Africa. That's the sort of level of job title at the moment you've got with these companies that are still relatively small in business terms and business years, who are trying to build out. So I know they care about scaling. I would say find the country with the nearest partnership office near you. I know they have, in Twitter, they have one in, there's one in Amsterdam. And just keep knocking on their door. And unfortunately, that's the scale they're working at the moment. But it's improving all the time.
Just one, since you asked for practical suggestions, there are groups, for example, there's a social media editors group on Facebook, which is about 2,100 social media editors. Yeah, so often it's a lot faster posing a question and getting an answer there than trying to get somebody at Facebook to respond. So I think there are ways to kind of get the ecosystem to respond. But let's all be very clear, we tend to blame social media platforms a lot more than we blame anybody else. If any of us ever tries to reach a human being at Amazon with a complaint, talk to me if you can ever do that. Right? So we tend to kind of let a lot of these kind of companies have different business models, and then somehow we want like very different relationships with Facebooks and stuff. And the same thing goes for media houses, right? How it's not very easy for a reader to reach an editor.
Yeah.
Right? You can leave a lot of voicemails.
Glass houses.
We should also remember this, that, I mean, when talking about the industry acting together vis-a-vis the platforms, when the book publishers tried to do this collectively vis-a-vis Amazon, the antitrust authorities came down on the publishers, not on the platform. So it's not always easy to act together, even if you have common interests, as was suggested. There is a question over here.
Yes, this is my name is Borja Rojano. I'm actually building a platform. So basically, I'm going to come to this side of the argument because I feel the conversation has been a bit platform bashing until now. When I hear the discussion, sometimes it makes me feel that news organizations don't get that the world has changed. The advent of platforms, for me, as a technologist, as a consumer of media, is equivalent to the appearance of the printing press. Basically, it's destroying the role of many gatekeepers. Mr. Narisetti said something when you asked him if News Corp would consider being a platform. That you said no, and you cited the example of it was New York Post and Wall Street Journal, I believe, saying as black and white, or two completely ends of the spectrum, more or less. People my generation and younger, we want a million shades of gray in between. We want a news source or an outlet that is personalized for me. Somebody mentioned Medium. For the past 2 years, 90% of my reading has been on Medium, and my friends too. And my Medium feed is completely different than my friend's Medium feed, and this is what I expect. With platforms, what we have seen is the emergence of the one-man media company. Think Casey Neistat, think Tim Ferriss. I think media becomes a meritocracy. The best voices surface because there are no gatekeepers. And I wonder if by not embracing platforms, you're being left out as a news organization. I don't know if there's going to be a role for a news organization in the next 50 years or 100 years.
I hope you're wrong, but I'm happy to be on any platform as long as you're willing to pay for the journalism that I create. As simple as that. Yeah. And the reason, I think you and I agree actually, the reason I said that we don't think of ourselves as a platform is if News Corp thought of itself as a platform, then it'll say, here are the 6 News Corp brands, and we serve all your needs. We're not going to put New York Times in it, right? That's what I meant by saying that I don't think of it as a platform as News Corp alone. That's what I meant. I think you and I are saying the same thing.
Yeah. I want to disagree with you, even though actually I don't think there has been much platform bashing. I think we've been really actually pretty nice about them. So here's what I'm going to disagree on. I'm slightly sick of hearing people saying people in news organisations don't understand. People in news organisations are losing their jobs all the time. They really understand. The question is, so why didn't they do something before that? Okay, well, I worked in one of those environments, and we did really well at The Guardian. We had brilliant technologists who worked on fantastic products. But to win at this, in 2004, you had to really invent Facebook and do it well. Don't do it like LiveJournal or Friendster. You know, this is going to an economy where 2 or 3 players are favoured. And in order to do that well, you had to stop doing journalism. And I don't think you can say now, with perfect 2020 hindsight, oh, news organisations have been, as it were, the architects of their own downfall. News organisations are doing journalism, which in the way that it was kind of configured before, wasn't going to be and isn't going to be sustainable. So yes, they have to change. I had a 3-hour conversation sort of in December over encrypted chat with Edward Snowden. He does not think that he would have been fine. I mean, he's not fine anyway, he's trapped in Russia, but he did not think that that story would have got to the outside world without an intermediary, which was focused on publishing. The ICIJ this week, which has a staff of, what, a dozen, slightly more than a dozen in Washington, has coordinated the most extraordinary reporting effort around, you know, the deepest sort of corruption. Journalism is hard work, and it's expensive. And it's not because there's a kind of an ignorance about what was going to happen, but we were really not able to, I think, do the kinds of things that you needed to do to build a platform. I think in what you say, there's something really valuable, though, which is how much now should news or independent journalism be investing in technology and separate types of publishing? And I think the answer to that is absolutely, and a lot more than they have been in the past, and in the future I think they will be able to invest more in that because they'll just have less infrastructure, printed newspapers, broadcast channels, etc., to maintain. But I think that we have to get away from this binary of, oh, the news organisations were just slow or stupid. You know, Silicon Valley money and thinking was very smart and very quick, and not many people have, you know, lots and lots of people have made a lot of money, but not many companies have survived the sort of the platform race. You know, there are lots and lots of those that have failed as well.
I want to make sure that there are more people who have an opportunity to ask questions. So if there are more, I think it's, I mean, I agree with you, by the way, personally. I mean, Google and Facebook and Amazon make my life better every day. I think it's still fair to ask the question whether journalism is going to be left as roadkill on what used to be called the information superhighway, which personally I don't think it will be. But the question, I suppose, is still fair. There are other questions, because otherwise I think you wanted to come back on this. There is one at the back, and then if there is time, we'll get you in again. Okay.
My name is Bas Mesters, heading a journalism school in the Netherlands. And I'm curious, what is your message to the students that are here and to the journalism schools? What does this all mean for the journalism schools?
Sorry, to go on about that, I did work in the journalism school, so I'll try and answer that. So when I turned up at Columbia, we were in the 6 years ago now, we were in the process of change. And at the time when I arrived, we didn't really teach any focused data courses, and we didn't teach any computational journalism, and we didn't have a research facility. Now 20% of the school is data or computationally focused. One of our classes was actually involved in some of the work around the Panama Papers. 3 or 4 of our very recent graduates were lead journalists, either at the ICIJ or at Fusion, on those, because you needed the skills that we think, that weren't previously taught, and it wasn't just Columbia, they weren't really taught anywhere. So what I would say is that there has never been a better time to be a journalist. You can do amazing stories and you can change the world. I think there are incredible sort of opportunities for reporting and working in new ways, which were not open to me when I started my career. And I think that there are things that you really need to be trained to do now, kind of like beyond sort of shorthand and a bit of law, which is what journalism training, was what I did. And I think journalism schools have to point themselves at the idea that publishing, I think, there's some existential risk attached to that. I don't think there's existential risk attached to journalism. One way or another, it's got to be done. And for no better time to be a journalism student, no better time to learn skills that aren't out there.
Can I just quickly add to that for the kind of journalists that we want to hire at the Huffington Post? First of all, I completely agree, Emily, there's no better time to be a journalist. But you still need a combination of traditional skills and like relentless curiosity and appetite for change and resilience. And the traditional skills that you need are how to do original reporting and how to make a really sharp story. But those are, those two fundamentals can be used in a wide variety of ways now, ways that we don't even know that are going to come up in 6 months. So that's the kind of attitude you need to have, is just be up for a lot of change and know how to tell a great story.
I mean, just very briefly, it used to be the case that you were a journalist and other people took care of the distribution and the business side of things. And I guess from my point of view, I think journalism schools now need to educate their students on the journalism very much, but also on distribution, largely digital, and business. Ask yourself the question, why are there journalists rather than no journalists? Why do someone pay my salary? There are for-profit reasons for that, and I think journalists need to understand those to be able to engage constructively in the development of new business models. We couldn't be left to the money people. I think that would be very, very dangerous, just as the technology shouldn't be left to the technologists. And I would also just say, I think it's worth going on the record. I don't know the situation in the Netherlands, but from my point of view, I think there are some of the best journalism schools in the US and the UK and the Nordic countries have risen to these challenges. I don't think they are as bad as their reputation sometimes are.
I'll tell them that on average you'll get paid less, on average you'll work longer, and on average you'll probably try out your journalism on half a dozen new platforms that you haven't even thought about.
A final question, I think at the back here, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yes, Georg Dahm from German startup Fair Better Media. And what I was wondering, you were talking about that companies have to, and publishers have to invest more into technology than they did in recent years. And I'm wondering, from my own experience, we spend a lot of money on our own publishing system. And now when I see the kind of features that the giants like Facebook and Google are rolling out, I stand there wondering why even bother. They can smash us just like this. So how much and in what areas of technology should a publisher even think about investing if he's in constant danger of being smashed by an unbeatable opposition?
So that was a voice of confidence and sort of can-do. Liz, do you want to take this on?
Yeah, well, I actually disagree with Emily a little bit. I actually think publishers now, it's a little bit of a gift to be able to rely on a Google or a Facebook, instant articles to to do, you know, what is expensive and hard. You know, they have millions of engineers and product managers. We don't in the media. What I do think is important is to have something of your own, like Emily was talking about before. So you have to find something that is just yours, and that does take technology. You know, for instance, like a mobile app is an important thing to have, but not if it's just, here's a summary of all of our stories. Like, no one's going to use, you know, we need to be real with ourselves that nobody's going to use that kind of mobile app anymore. Like, there has to be a reason to come to the app besides just to find the news from this particular publication. So I think there's value in technology, and especially if that technology is really consumer-facing, which is something that media organizations are not always great at. We tend to focus our technology efforts on what we need as newsrooms versus what our viewers and readers want. But I would take advantage of what some of the big platforms are offering and take a little bit off our plates.
If you don't invest more in, so I think, you know, Liz has disagreed with me. I'm going to say you're not really disagreeing with me. We really agree about this, which is that investment in technology isn't investment in some cronky old CMS that you're constantly having to patch up. Unfortunately, it's where we have to spend a lot of money. But first of all, data science. If you don't have, you know, a really first-rate data science team in your organization, you are missing out, and you're never going to do particularly well, I think, if you're a journalism organization. Think about things that you will be able to build on top of data that you collect. News organizations should also be in the business of collecting data and data practice, all of which is computational, right? That's all investment in technology. And I think that sort of, you know, we had a really fascinating session earlier on today about artificial intelligence and, you know, kind of insights and prediction. And these are things that are these are consumer-facing, story-based or product-based things, which actually you shouldn't be leaving to Facebook or Google or whatever. And I think an interesting bit of negotiation now is, what are the things that you want to outsource to the platforms? Because I agree, which is, you know, why build an amazing but not very good, you know, it's amazing that you've built it, but it's not very good, sort of, you know, vessel for video, when you've got, you know, artificial intelligence at Facebook. I heard somebody told me they had 700 engineers working on AI. No news organization can match that. But how can you report stories about the modern world if you're not investing in the kind of technologists who will work with that? And we see that time and time and time again, actually, now in building and reporting things. So it may just be that the investment in technology, we think about it in a very old-fashioned way, and we should be thinking about it in a different way.
I think if you reframe the question, it should be more about build versus rent or buy. And you should be investing a lot in applications and kind of using kind of technology to understand your audiences. But there's absolutely no reason in this day and age not to look at a WordPress or any of the other alternatives out there and say, if they are not kind of competing against us on our basic business model, like advertising and those issues, there's no reason to kind of try to build your own platform. A lot of big media companies tend to do this at a cost basis and say it's cheaper for us to build our own platform, but they always price the version 1 and forget that there'll be a version 2, 3, 4, and 5, and there are complete companies that are building those on a regular basis. So you don't ever factor in the cost of like upgrading your CMS. So a lot of CTOs kind of con you once or twice in getting their own CMS, and then later you realize it's a lot more expensive to keep it up.
I mean, let's just remember a lot of media organizations have spent a lot of money on technology for a long time. I mean, think about broadcasters, for example. I think then the question is the balance. Can you get the balance right between investing and maintaining the infrastructure that serve your current audience while also making sure that you make those targeted investments where you are going to do things that are for you rather than generic off-the-shelf tools or tools developed for other purposes. So if you want to automate journalism specifically, maybe there are some particular applications that are distinct to your organization. So there are, I agree with you. I mean, obviously you can't go sort of head-to-head with some of the big platforms. I mean, it would be ridiculous of sort of a mid-sized European publisher to try to develop a search engine to compete with Google or an AI for that matter. But there are other places where there is a question of calibrating between serving, you know, maintaining the infrastructure to the 20th century and building the infrastructure of digital journalism in the 21st century. Joanne, do you have any sort of final thoughts on this, or?
I mean,
No.
Use Twitter. Yeah, use Twitter, use Moments. No. Sound like corporate awfulness. No. Ultimately, it's every single organization is kind of on their own difficult journey at the moment. But if I can,
ask you to do anything, it's to try and see through the fear and try and focus on what you really do best, because there is some incredible journalism out there, and focusing on what you're really good at is ultimately going to be the key to help you survive.
I think that's a perfect note on which to end. I mean, one of the people we interviewed for our research in this area said it's an amazing time if you're great at what you're doing. That doesn't mean it's an easy time or a comforting time, but if you're great at what you're doing, it is a joy to be alive. Thank you very much to our panelists and to all of you. Should I say in the trenches or in the collaborative meetings in which some of these issues are being hashed out as we speak? So with that introduction, Emily, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rasmus. Just a sort of brief introduction. I'm Emily Bell, Director of the Tower Centre, which is situated in the Journalism School at Columbia University. Before that, I was a journalist for a long time. And the last 10 years of that, as many of you know, was at The Guardian as an editor and sort of director of digital. And a lot of my job there was really trying to put into practical application the idea that as journalists we should, and journalism organisations, we should integrate much more closely with the fabric of the social web. And as a result, we employed brilliant people like Joanna, but we also kind of had initiatives to use Twitter early, etc., etc. So this is a kind of a cautionary tale because it's slightly be careful what you wish for. Since then, and at the Tower Centre, we're now doing a whole series of different research studies on the relationship between platforms and publishers. So anybody who actually has something interesting to say, come and find me or Dr. Claire Wardle, our research director, because we're doing content studies. We're also doing a sort of a landscape review as well, which you should have in your hands in the next couple of months. And my interest in this really is partly as a practitioner and now as an academic to say, what does it mean when publishing really becomes one of the activities of platforms? So in speeches I've given in the past, I've said that for me, the really serious issue here is, if you like, kind of not exactly a losing of independence of the press, but a dependence on a completely different distribution ecosystem, which in many ways, it has to be said, is better. So, you know, there is no doubt that getting your news through the tools that engineers at Twitter and Facebook build is better in terms of how quickly you receive it, in terms of the overall user experience, in terms of the design, perhaps than many publishers in, you know, and their own websites. But there is an existential.
Am I meant to be in this one?
I think you are, yes.
Are you a notes writer?
I went to the wrong one.
Nick some more pen and
I was almost on stage talking.
Otherwise I will.
I found the right one.
How should I introduce you? What's your title?
I am the head of head of curation for Moments.
Does that work?
Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I know. I'm sorry. Should
No,
I write it down?
Curation, Twitter Moments, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Got it.
Nope, nothing. I am completely on water. Water would be lovely. Still.
It's really warm in these.
It's absolutely sweltering. Like, the level of oxygen must be so low.
My daughter put a temporary tattoo on it that I completely forgot about. It's in New York, so there's also a piece around.
So how's it going? Are you now back over the fence?
Yeah, it's great.
Well, don't let technologists who are saying they're not creative. Are you going to FA next week?
I'm not. Jared Darcy goes.
Right. Just for colour. Well, no, to interview. These are interviews. So, yes. They don't necessarily. Well, maybe. Don't know that. Don't know. I mean, there was. No, Alexa says, oh, if you come to FA, we can probably get you some interviews, but there are also people I know, both who are not.
Welcome, everybody.
Research group there who
Welcome.
be our students. So.
Is this on? Yes, this is on. Terrific. Thank you very much, everyone, for your patience. Both of those of you who were in the room and enjoying what I gather was a very good panel that had started a little bit late, so sorry for sort of barging in on your panel, but also very much those who are patiently waiting outside, including the panelists. This is the panel on platform publishing, ? And I think the question mark is an important part of our conversation today. We will be discussing what's arguably one of the most important things going on in the digital media environment right now, the increasing importance of intermediaries like search engines and social media in terms of how people find and access news. And we will talk both about some of the issues some of the ways in which publishers think about these issues, but also hear from Joanne Gary, who represent one of the platforms. So we have today with us a fantastic panel, in my humble opinion, to discuss this issue. Emily Bell, who is director of the Tao Center at Columbia University. Raju Narisetti, who is senior vice president for strategy at News Corp. Liz Heron, the executive editor of the Huffington Post, also with a past at Facebook. And the special guest added after the program was printed and even after it was put online. Joanne Gary, who is head of curation for Twitter Moments, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I'm Rasmus Nielsen. I'm director of research at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I will say a few things about some of our own work in this area, but mostly I am here to listen to and learn from our distinguished panelists. So what we have agreed is that Emily will kick us off, since she is one of the people who have spoken and written very publicly about these issues and has a very clear sort of take on what some of the issues at stake are. I will add a few observations from some ongoing research we have at the Reuters Institute in this area, and then we will hear from the people who are...
potential risk attached to it. And what we've seen in the past year is a progression from where platforms were saying, we don't really get involved with this stuff, we just carry what you guys do, into them saying, no, we are active actors in this area. Even if they don't identify themselves as publishers, they are taking on more of the role of publisher. So you had Snapchat Discover launched at the end of January, you had Facebook's Instant Articles launching in April last year, you've had Google's accelerated mobile pages and also their digital news initiative. You've had Twitter Moments. So you're beginning to see these kind of like seamless acts of news publishing. I don't think there's any alternative. I think that journalism has to be more tightly integrated with the social platforms that people use and that they find useful for getting news. But big questions about transparency, how and which stories are promoted and how is something which in much more open systems like Twitter is kind of obvious. In more closed systems like Facebook is not obvious, and it can be opaque. The next thing is business models. We know that at the same time that we see this big rise in mobile social use, we're also seeing the rise in ad blocking, which is making it harder for news organizations to monetize their digital content. Again, I will say that's not wholly a bad thing, in that there are lots of trackers and data capture on mobile advertising. It's not something that publishers have done particularly well. They don't get free pass on that. Platforms often do it better. And we're at the beginning of a new conversation, I think, which says, is the balance of power healthy? Is it something which we have enough clarity about, both as publishers, but also as citizens. You know, is this something where we need to reevaluate what we think about the fourth estate? And a lot of this is very obscure. We don't really know. It's very early days, and we don't quite know how this is going to play out. So, for instance, on instant articles, you hear some publishers going, they're tremendous and work very well, and others saying, we're seeing absolutely no effect whatsoever. So there's an awful lot to sort of pick apart. And my overarching view is that there are 2 or 3 really big issues embedded in this in this overall sort of shift, which, as I say, I don't think it's an argument about whether we should be going there, because I think that's happened. I think that's already happened. It's more about, are there things that we should now be doing to affect the terms of practice and service and ethics within that field. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emily. I should say that I'm very much inspired by a lecture that Emily gave at the Reuters Institute a little while back. I mean, we've been trying to address some of these issues by talking to different publishers and platforms about how they handle this relationship in light of the very rapid development that Emily is outlining. And just in terms of sort of by virtue of a bit of background on this, if you will, that in terms of how we think about how people get news, just to remind everyone in the room of how important this is growing in some markets. Last year, in the digital news report that we do every year at the Institute, when we surveyed online news users here in Italy, for example, and asked people, how do you find and access news online? 20% of these online news users in Italy said that they found and accessed news by going to news websites. 66% say they find and access news via search engines, and 33% said they find and access news via social media. And mind you, this is before the development of the new initiatives that Emily highlighted, like Facebook Instant Articles and Google AMP. So in terms of the audience engagement, this is a quite dramatic change from a time in which publishers largely controlled many of the channels through which they reached the audience, insofar as the audience wanted to be reached. The interviews we've been doing with publishers across Europe and North America, I'm working with a colleague of mine, Sarah Ganter, on this project. I think we can sort of tentatively identify 3 different reactions from publishers' side: coexistence, confrontation, and collaboration. And very sort of clearly, what we might think of as sort of reactive coexistence is by far the most common outcome. Most of the media organizations we talk to essentially say, to quote one person we interviewed, they are huge, we are tiny, what do you expect us to do? So obviously Google and Facebook are not forces of nature, but if